afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the eighth and final episode of the fifth season of the Center's Religion and series for 2025. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics, practitioners, hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. The last episode was an engaging and wide-ranging discussion on religion and Latinx traditions, hosted by Lord Barber, with a great panel including Jonathan Calvillo, Gaston Espinoza, and Suhe Vega. If you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel, or if you just want to listen to this or any episode, we are now available everywhere you download your favorite podcasts. On today's episode of Religion and I have invited scholars to engage in a wide-ranging conversation with Dr. Judith Weisenfeld on facets of her newest publication, Black Religion in the Madhouse, Race and Psychiatry in Slavery's Wake. And that we will also have an opportunity to talk with Dr. Weisenfeld about things and items and ideas that unpack religious beliefs, new religious movements, and religious excitement as a psychiatric concept and institutionalization. But in addition to talking about her latest work, we're going to also have a chance to talk about her impact on the field of American religion, her work in African and African American religious studies, her thoughts about the university, and really where we are going in today's world. So it will be a wide-ranging conversation. I don't want to scare Judith or Pippa, but I think we're going to cover a lot of things this afternoon, and I am so excited to be your host today to help to facilitate and to shepherd this conversation. Joining me as a co-host and a panelist is Dr. Pippa Cock, who is an associate professor of religious studies at Missouri State University. Her research and teaching center on religion, health, and society in America and its global context. Her recent publications include Records of Relinquishment, Caregiving and Emotion in the Philanthropy Archive, an article which appeared in the Public Historian in May 2024, as well as her first book, The Course of God's Providence, Religion, Health, and the Body in Early America, which was published in 2021 by NYU Press. She is currently working on her next book, Medicine and American Religion, which is under contract with Routledge Press. So thank you, Pippa, for joining us and for being a co-host and a panelist with me this afternoon. Our featured panelist and guest is Dr. Judith Weisenfeld, who is the Agate Brown and George L. Collard Professor of Religion and Associate Faculty in the Department of African American Studies and the Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton University. Her research focuses on early 20th century African American religious history, including the relation of religion to the constructions of race, the impact on Black religious life on migration, immigration, and urbanization, African American women's religious history, religion in film and popular culture, and for today and now forever, religion and medicine. And so you can see that her work and her expertise is wide-ranging. She is the author of Black Religion in the Madhouse, Race and Psychiatry in Slavery's Wake, that will be coming out this year. New World A-Coming, Black Religion and Racial Identity During the Great Migration, which was NYU Press in 2016, which won the 2017 Albert J. Rabbitoh Prize for the best book in Africana religions. She also wrote Hollywood Be Thy Name, African American Religion in American Film, 1929 to 1949. And we were just talking about her first text that I love, African American Women and Christian Activism, New York's Black YWCA, 1905 to 1945, as well as a number of articles and book chapters and podcasts and everything in between, talking about religion, American culture, and Black culture, and really the future of humanities. And so I am excited and I'm just really overjoyed to welcome Dr. Judith Weisenfeld to Religion and to have Pippa here as a co-host and a co-panelist, and we want to jump right in. So again, thank you all who are joining us live today. Let's jump in and have this conversation. So I wanted to start out and talk a little bit have an opportunity for Judith to introduce herself to this audience, and to talk a little bit about, you know, who she is and how she got to this work. As I read Religion in the Madhouse, and we were able to read some of the earlier copies of it, I was moved by the ways, Judith, that you humanized and added texture to the lives and materiality of the Black women and men who populated the asylums and the hospitals and the madhouses across the country that you studied. Your tedious and careful attention to the archive is noteworthy, and there's nothing new about that. That's always been a critical aspect of your work. Your tedious and careful attention to the archive, and it made me, as I was reading this, a little bit more interested in your archive, in your origin story, if you might add. When did you realize that Black religion was going to be your area of study? And what, if any, are the moments from your life or your engagement with the broader world that seeded this interest with Black religion, as I've named in your biography and all those different things? So let's just jump right in. Talk to us, Judith.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Thank you for the invitation. It was terrifying, I will say. And but I'm really happy to be here in conversation with you. And thank you again, Pippa, for agreeing to jump in and be part of this. My origin story, my villain origin story. Um, I I was a religion major undergraduate at Barnard College, and at the time just kind of taking whatever courses were there and that interested me. And I think I had taken mostly kind of early Christianity, New Testament, um, and there was a visitor in the department who's now at Dartmouth College, Robert Baum, who's an historian of religion in Africa. He was in graduate school, and he arrived right when I became a major, and so I started taking courses on African religions, and he taught a course called Religion in Racially Stratified Societies. He did it as a comparative U.S. South Africa course, and it was also in the middle of the campus protest to divest from apartheid South Africa.
Mm,
And I was not a leader by any means in the protest, but I was a participant in a kind of 2 week uh, takeover outside of a building, and it was like it was a community education experience. People would come and talk to us about the history of South Africa, and um, it was a really transformative experience, and that combined with the courses I was taking with Bob about religion and race, it turned me from New Testament early Christianity to African American religious history. And in that course with him, I read the two books that I think shape what I've done in profound ways. One was Al Rabato's Slave Religion.
yes.
So I was taking that course in the mid 80s, so it was not that long after it had been published. So it was, it was not what it is. It was not the field defining classic we think of it now, but it really had a powerful effect on me in just this way of thinking about how do we tell stories about people about whom we've been told, don't have
Mm,
material to tell their stories, recover their perspectives. And the other text I read in that course was Arthur Huff Fawcett's Black Gods of the Metropolis, where I developed my insatiable interest in Father Divine. So, um, yeah, those two things, and I don't know. I mean, there's a long story maybe about how I ended up deciding to go to graduate school, but when I did apply, I applied to work with Al, and I was fortunate to do so. And I applied um, uh, proposing to work on new religious movements of the Great Migration, which I didn't get around to for a while for other reasons. But it was a combination of that, the kind of political moment and the tremendous opportunity to take courses that really connected to what was going on and helped me historicize how people had used religion, had engaged religion, mobilized it for social change purposes. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the influence of James Cone and Black theology on anti-apartheid theologies in South Africa.
Oh, I love this. I mean, always telling my audience and folks out there that, we got to return to some of these classic texts. And I know that, Judith, you've done that through your work. You're constantly reminding us, reviving, returning, revisioning some of these texts. I want to jump in, and I'm going to, bring Pippa into the conversation with us here. I want us to think a little bit about the way in which African and Black religion shapes or informs the study of American religion, right? We have a lot of scholars on this conversation today with us who study American religion. What does it mean to kind of study American religion from the perspective of Black religion, Black culture, in that way? I mean, I always think about Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, that she says like Africanism or Blackness is inextricable from the definition of America, right? That in some ways we don't need the prefix Black, or in order to kind of do this work, even though we attach it when we're talking or when I'm introducing someone like you. Judith, can you talk to our audience and to us a little bit about how you think about those distinctions, if there is any?
Yeah, I mean, it's so great that you invoke that. Playing in the Dark has been a really influential text for me. I mean, I think about that in two ways. So Morrison's talking about the American Africanism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I guess if I had to, I think about the work I've done in two buckets, maybe. One is, and they overlap at certain points, the kind of work that Al Raboteau was doing and that attracted me to work with him is the kind of recovery. What are the stories we're going to tell about African American religious history in new ways? I mean, I never worked on the period of slavery, but what are the stories? How do we recover? What kinds of sources can we use to kind of flesh out those stories? And then the other is more on the kind of figure of the American Africanism. In what ways has a kind of specter of Blackness and Black religion shaped American politics, religion, culture? And so Hollywood Be Thy Name, I was interested in what sense I could make of this presence in every early American sound film that had an all-Black cast of a religious context. Like what was it doing for them to set these films in a religious context? What kinds of arguments were they making about race, about religion, about citizenship? And this work on psychiatry is similar in that way. How did some kind of specter of Black religion feature in early psychiatric theory about race and kind of mental well-being? So, I mean, these overlap at different times, but I see them as related, but not entirely overlapping. So when I'm writing about race and religion, the construction of race, it's not always satisfying to me because there are other things to say about the very rich and complicated history of African American religious history. It's not always about the figure of the American Africanism.
Yeah. I want to bring Pippa in, but I'm so struck by this notion that, in film, in Black culture, or in American culture, in this text around medicine and psychiatry, this fascination with the Black religious community. What do we really think is at the core of that? I mean, I really wonder, like, what is it that makes Black religion so interesting, strange, monstrous, or or worthy of study? I mean, maybe we could use any of those terms to this broader culture that it shows up over and over again in these places.
That's a real question. That's not a rhetorical question.
Yeah, it's a real, yeah.
Okay. You want to answer that? what is it?
What is, I mean, I wonder
You
what
know,
it is. Yeah.
it's racism, but
Yeah. Right.
it's a really, so this is another thing I struggle with, like how much time do I want to spend writing about
Yes.
medical racism or media
Hmm.
representational racism? And I've spent a lot of time writing about that. And um I do think that it's important to understand the kind of life and afterlife, or the kind of eternal return of some of these figures, and how they work in different times and places. And so, one of the things that I learned in doing the research for this book was how to chart the emergence of this kind of account of Black religion as monstrous and dangerous
Mm,
in the, obviously it has longer roots, but the emergence of it as um, a useful mode of talking about U.S. political life in the
mm,
immediate wake of slavery. That
mm,
so it kind of erupts there in relation to or through
yeah.
psychiatry, as it too is emerging, and to chart its transformations and endurance over time. It's just it seemed, I was frankly surprised at how durable that the kind of
Mm,
nugget of it was. And then to see it deployed and redeployed in different ways was um, turned out to be kind of one of the main stories of the book. And so it is just,
mm,
it becomes a kind of shorthand sign and symptom of kind of civic incapacity
mhm.
at different times. And I think I would say that's an argument that connects both the film and medicine part of the story.
No, thank you so much. I mean, I want to, I want us to think that through, and I'm going to bring Pippa in. Pippa, could you talk a little bit about how you are also seeing some of this in your work? So, I mean, one of the questions I have for Pippa as we all get into this conversation is, as a scholar who studies medicine, race, and religion as well, you are also seeing the way in which Black religion shows up in your work, Pippa, or Black religion shows up in the communities that you're studying. Um, and so my question for you is, how do you see it showing up? But also, how have you engaged scholars like Judith or others who have helped us think about Black religion and its relationship to the study of what has, ostensibly been called American religion? So could you jump in a little bit there, Pippa?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to overstate how helpful Judith's work has been in studying early America. And the sort of right now, for example, I'm working on a project on explorers and missionaries and their sort of attempts to scientifically categorize the world that they are, that's emerging, that they're encountering, that they, this movement of peoples and all the powerful empires that are
Mhm.
behind this work, right? And so reading this book was just really helpful, even though I'm working on an earlier time period, in terms of sort of seeing how that scientific gaze is emerging to think about both race and religion, right? And
Mm,
they're inextricable for these explorers who are writing these accounts when they're trying to sort of describe a world that they see as savage. They're describing it both in terms of how people look and how they behave and their rituals and all these things. And so it really felt like reading, I mean, it's building, thinking of your earlier work too, and on the framework of a religio-racial identity. This works so well in sort of furthering that for those of us who are thinking about knowledge making and the role that that plays in contributing to how we think about race, right? And both of others, right? Of this world of others that Europeans are encountering, but also how Europeans are thinking about themselves and creating a whiteness, right? And an acceptable norm
mm,
of health and of behavior and of what, and religion is deeply tied into that. So so yeah, I mean, it worked. It was so helpful to read this book and to see how beautifully you developed these themes, and so convincingly too. It's just a wonderful contribution to that conversation. So thank you for that. Do you want me to? Should I ask a question now, or I don't want you?
Yeah.
You are on a roll, Joseph. So
No. I mean, I love this. I mean, these like ideas about this longer kind of construction of America. I mean, I think that Judith, you're talking about it in a particular time period, but I mean, we could go either way. I mean, you do in your book, you move us all the way up to the contemporary moment, and at least in the conclusion. But also, we can go all the way back to the very founding moments and have this same conversation around how this construction of, the other through racism, white supremacy, through religious tropes kind of shows up over and over again. And it's powerful, I think, to see it in this particular example, but we could connect it in a lot of different ways. But yeah, let's keep moving.
I'll just say one quick
Oh,
thing
good.
that
Yeah.
I got into this because I was pulling a thread from the 1930s and psychiatric studies about Father Divine's followers, and there was an element to them that felt very 19th century to me, and I couldn't figure out what it was when I was writing the last book. And when I pulled that thread, this whole thing tumbled out. And so again, one could pull a thread from the 19th century material I have and go backwards, definitely.
I wanted to return, if you don't mind, to what you were saying about Al Rabbitoe and this question he asked you about, how do we tell stories? What stories do we tell? How do we gather these? One of the things that your book made me think of was, scholarship on the archive, and thinking, I was recently reading, I was working on a project on reform institutions, and I was troubled by what sources are available, right, and the limitations of those sources. And then I spent a lot of time reading Jennifer Morgan and Sadia Hartman and Stephanie Smallwood. People, and your work reminded me so much of these scholars who, many of them work more on slavery in earlier periods, but you're working with also very difficult archives. In some ways, they're difficult because they're also shaped by racism and the silences that has created, but they're also difficult because they're psychiatric and medical archives. And so there are additional restrictions and burdens on these archives. And so I just wanted to ask you about what it's like to work with these archives. How did you pull stories out of them? And I'm asking this partly because you start the book with this incredibly gripping archival encounter where you describe Judy B's photograph, and she's a patient at I can't remember the name of the institute.
St. Elizabeth's Hospital.
St. Elizabeth's. And there's this hand from outside the frame gripping her head. And then you come back to this image and say that you cannot forget it. And it made me think about this sort of powerful emotional pull of the archive and also the horror that can occur in an archive. So I would just like to hear you reflect on how you worked with these sources, how you found these sources, and just the challenges that they presented.
Yeah, I didn't know, when I pulled that thread from looking at the published psychiatric studies, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know. I felt like I had, I had all of this theoretical literature, and I didn't know exactly how to connect it to people's experiences. So that, that was the first material I read. I actually started, as I was deciding whether I was going to pursue this, I was using the California State Hospital admissions records, and they're digitized. They're on Ancestry.com. And so I was able to keyword search and look at what was going on with Black patients, and I found these listings of a diagnosis or an indication of a cause of insanity, of religious excitement. It was kind of the first place I started to figure out something that was going on. But then, yeah, then I had to figure out where these hospital archives might be, which ones were accessible. When I actually went to the California State Archives, they wouldn't let me see much of anything. And I said, but you've got it online. And they wouldn't let me. St. Elizabeth's, the government hospital for the insane, is accessible because it was a government hospital. And I found a couple of other archives where I could look at either commitment paperwork or some hospital records. But it was very spotty, and it was a lot of work to, and like the number of files was voluminous, but what was written on them was often very, very little. And I was often just so stuck on the fact that people could spend decades in a hospital, and either nobody wrote anything, or it was discarded, like the whole record of their time there. But I just, how did I find them? These are state hospital records, and I just worked through a lot of them. The admissions registers give you a key to what might be in them, but it was hard. I mean, finding children. These are hospitals that housed people with a variety of conditions, physical conditions, and of all ages, knowing that in some cases people were forcibly sterilized. Those records were hard to trace out, and that these were basically in 19th and early 20th century places where people were put to labor, so an extension of the a kind of plantation system, and it was hard. And with the government hospital for the insane, St. Elizabeth's files, at a certain point, there are autopsy photographs in the files for people who died there. And the stock, it's a cardboard stock, and I would open the folder and kind of feel for the different textures of the paper to decide like how I was going to turn the page and prepare myself to see, something to me just as shocking of that image of Judy B with this white man's hand on her head. So it was, the research was hard, and I am laughing. I think I see Rachel Gross on this call, and I think I said to her once that, I didn't realize how depressed I was doing all this research. And she said to me, "Oh, Judith, you were so depressed. Everybody knew it." But so, for me, I felt a responsibility to find ways to write about people I could write about, flesh out stories and make them more than just the court records and the medical records. And, I don't know, I tried, but it's the kinds of records we have make it really, really hard. I was thinking, I'm turning it on you, Pip. I know you worked with letters and memoirs, and I found those things occasionally, but the kind of material that you foregrounded in your book, and how people processed the experience, was really rare, because everything in this case was filtered through the doctors and judges.
Yeah, memoirs and letters are their own, it's their own problem, right?
Yes.
They follow their own generic conventions, and they hide things, but on the other hand, they're this gift to sort of compare to texts that are published, and to sort of get a sense. But yeah, and some of my more recent work, I'm coming up with these really different kinds of archival sources, and it's just so challenging. I think you did a remarkable job at bringing voices to a lot of people, and sometimes in surprising ways. When you talked about, someone from kind of a more, I think is the chapter on Pentecostals and holiness, they might have family members who who are who are brought in and interviewed, and they have their own take on their their loved one's behavior that doesn't mesh with the psychiatric take, and so you get this really nuanced and rich picture of how different people are reacting to religious excitement, and that's just those are fantastic moments when you were able to sort of bring those. And I don't know how often you were able to find them, but when they come up in the book, they're just such a rich glimpse into these people's lives.
It is. I mean, it's so rich, and I mean, I want to ask you, Judith, also like these hidden cadences of respectability that pop up in your text, like that. When again in that chapter, when these folks are coming in, when the other kind of Black churches or Black leaders are commenting on some of these movements, and in many ways, one might argue that your career or a lot of your work has been an accounting or maybe a resistance to certain norms of Black respectability by certain folks that you study, especially in the second half of your career, right? What do you say about that in terms of how this particular text or how these particular archives are connected to Black culture or Black communities, kind of deep anxiety around, right? Being recognized as normal or normative or respectable, as these archives are now coming to light and being read by folks like you or other people.
That's a great question. And I start the book with a chapter on really kind of unusual set of events in Liberty County, Georgia in 1889, for two reasons. One, I wanted to try and show that that the medical discourse is not all that different from the popular culture discourse.
Right.
That the theoretical literature describes, the category of like an innate Negro superstition in ways that are very common in popular culture. And that chapter is about situating the stakes for Black people in the wake, the immediate wake of slavery, the stakes of a public discourse about a connection between Black religion and insanity, and therefore civic incapacity. And so the stakes, and in that there are Black clergy who are acting to try and quell this religious enthusiasm that's going on. And so, from the start, I wanted to position, even though there aren't psychiatrists in there, but this as a question that has profound consequences for Black people's participation in American life. And so clergy are intervening there. But in the, one thing that came clear to me, and Martin Summers writes about this in his history of St. Elizabeth's Hospital and African American patients, that, the hospitals are, on the one hand, a kind of good development that these state hospitals exist. And sometimes they're segregated hospitals, and sometimes they are Black patients are segregated within. And you'll see this discourse, it's good. There's now a place where people can be cared for, and we are taxpayers, and people are making claims on the state via the hospitals for care, right? We are taxpayers, people will say in various points. And so, we should have access to these institutions, and families of people who are in need of some kind of care are asking for help. I mean, one of the very first files I came upon was a family in Virginia, and they were doing they were prospering in all kinds of ways, financially, educationally, and one of the sons was committed to the Central State Hospital, and they tried to keep him at home for a while instead of, he was committed. They tried to treat him at home, but there's a letter in the file. His father writes, the hospital's overcrowded, and his father is writing, please, as soon as there's a place, please come and get him because he needs help. And he was committed, and then he was released, and actually eventually went to Harlem and became a real estate agent. But you can see in this a much more complicated relationship between communities and the hospitals than I had imagined before I went into the research. And it's not, so and there is something about the work of disciplining Black religion in the hospitals that, again, clergy kind of participate in that as well. So there's a very kind of complicated landscape of engagement with these institutions and the theories, and the stakes are, partly about respectability.
Yeah. I mean, I love how, and I want to bring Pippa back in. Just, I mean, I love how in the text, and you talk a lot about that. This is about the question about not only a particular argument about Black religion or excitement or emotionalism, but about a fitness for civic participation, about a litmus test, if you will, for like for citizenship, if in one way, and that and so that this text, and I think again, that's another theme that runs throughout your work, right? About throughout your works about this fitness for civic participation and how these regimes either enable or disable folks from being able to participate, right? And so I definitely want us to kind of keep that thread alive, even as we move to some of the other questions. So I wanted to ask you and Pippa, as you both write on disease and the medicalization of certain bodies and populations, how do you distinguish between biopolitical regimes or these control mechanisms that we're seeing, Judith, in your text, that we see early in the colonial moment, Pippa, in your work, and authentic interest in scientific advancement? I think that some people would ask, this was, and might ask you, Judith, like, this was the rise of a medical establishment. These were new medical inventions and interventions that were taking place. Was there authentic interest in scientific advancement and about learning and managing populations, or is learning and managing populations always about a denial of subjectivity, a Foucauldian ordering of the other? What do we have there? Like, and do both exist at the same time? So I mean, Pippa and Judith, I want y'all to both to jump in for this question.
Do you want to go first, please?
Do I want to? Maybe my answer also leads to something else I know that you were interested in, Pippa. I'm not sure how to answer that in terms of what motivated these psychiatrists exactly. I mean, I try and locate them in broader context than just the medical, which was very important to me. But so in the early period, it did seem to me that in the aggregate, the kind of theories they're producing, they're going to these conferences. The National Society of Charity and Correction is a very important venue where all these theories come out of Southern state hospitals early on, because that these are the physicians who are working with Black population for the most part. But it's propagated through publication in the major medical journals and through engagement with other physicians and people in charge of a variety of institutions at this Society of Charity and Correction. And it seems to be a grand project of containment. In the way they're talking. So someone will give a paper about, insanity and the colored race, and there'd be the notes of the discussion. And it really is about, what are we to do with this population? They're they're no longer subject to the beneficial control of slavery. And so what are we going to do? And so it really does feel, certainly in the late 19th century, as a problem of containment of people, and the argument about that these psychiatrists make, that there is an epidemic of mental illness, kind of public health problem, is they argue because Black people are incapable of managing freedom, right, of self-governance. And so that's how that broad literature reads to me, which doesn't make it not genuinely scientific, right? However we define that, but it is the science of the time that is in service of a certain kind of how they defined social good.
Pippa, what do you think on that topic?
I mean, I think that you could look to, like, I think it might be easier to find to make an argument of something that's more did you say authentic? I can't remember. To find something, some sort of more authentic sense of, someone who's really actually committed to healing, in the colonial world, like early, kind of before the professionalization of medicine, if you can get back to sort of, midwives and healers and even some physicians, depending when and where they trained, maybe operating outside some of those, like, biopolitical networks that we start to see really emerging more strongly, as colonial expansion begins. But I think, it gets hard by the 18th century to extract anyone from those larger systems and powers. And it's obvious. I love to teach John Wesley, who's very boring in many ways, but the founder of the Methodists, because he's so upset about what's happening in medicine because he thinks it's getting away from actually helping people. That's a major part of Wesley's writings on medicine, is that it's becoming interested in profits and theories and out of the reach of humanity. So you start to see this kind of screed against medicalization emerging that I think is widely felt. Like, this was popular, what he was saying. And so at the same time, like, no one can get away from it. Everyone becomes touched by it, even people who are resisting it, and this is what I find. So, even people who are kind of operating on the margins or on the fringe or trying to push back against medical authority end up adopting the similar sort of procedures of diagnosis and treatment and patient cases. Like, you can't actually operate. We all are within that system and it's especially true now. Even people who are, devote themselves to wellness culture, it still operates within that paradigm of biomedicine. So I'm not answering your question. I would be reluctant to say, though, that there are, I work with healthcare students and they genuinely want to help people. And, and we all live within systems of power that we don't always recognize, right? And so, but I do think there are people who pursue that profession. And I believe there were people in the past who pursued such work with an authentic interest in actually helping people. But how they are able to within these larger powerful structures is obviously very challenging to see. So
yeah. No, I wanted to pull that out and tease it out, because I do think there's a moment, Judith, in your text, especially when you're ending the text and the conclusion, where you're kind of, you fast forward us to a contemporary moment and you talk about some of the same kind of medicalized language being used against folks, whether they are engaging in non-normative, Africanist, Afro-Cubanist religious practices, whether they are being stopped by police, as a result of a police encounter. Like, you're saying that this same type of medicalization still kind of populates the way in which the larger biopolitical regime interacts with, non-normative, problematic bodies, right? Over and over again, we see that. So I want to ask folks, we have about 15 minutes left in this, and I want to kind of invite folks to drop questions into the chat, into the Q&A feature of Zoom, because we're going to start bringing some of those to bear. But is there any other topics or issues that we want to address here, Judith, that you want to kind of tease out from your work, that as you were finishing up this text, what are you still, struggling with or thinking about or want to return to, or that you want us to kind of think about together for the next, 2 or 3 minutes before we start taking some questions for the audience.
So much, but I was interested in a question that Pippa had posed in our earlier exchange about kind of secular versus religious. I don't know if you want to pose a version of that question.
Sure. This was my question that I really wanted to ask, so I'm glad we'll get to it. You explained very clearly that the story of religion and development of psychiatry is not a case of religion versus secular authority, but rather a case in which psychiatry, which is this so-called secular authority, is acutely shaped by white Protestant norms of rationality and civilization. And you use this fantastic quote from Terence Keall.
I love it. I love it.
How the secular acts as the mask for the religious. And I would love to hear you discuss how you developed this point. Was this kind of, it's the linchpin of the book in many ways. Was this did you already know you wanted to make this argument before you started? Because it highlights so well what you're describing. It's not simply scientific or medical racism, but what's happening here is a racism that's emerging from a certain variety of religion. And so I just want to know, like, what made that click for you?
Yeah.
When did you realize that was the key argument here? What I took to be a key argument of your book. So
yeah, it became very important. I think I handle it sometimes in a really clunky way, but I will shout out Terence Keall, who in like when I first met him and was reading part of what became Divine Variations in a workshop at Princeton, and we just started talking about. I think I was saying, "Oh yeah, I think I'm working on this project." He was one of the early people to really encourage me to pursue it. And reading his work really helped me think about this, how he describes the kind of, secular mask of a kind of, right, how Christian thought suffuses scientific thinking about race. And but I came to it partly just in a kind of archival nerdy way, in that I had read a lot about these early hospital doctors and I'd read this theoretical literature, and in the secondary literature it would just say, Dr. so and so, superintendent of whatever, and I just wondered who are these people actually.
Right.
And so when I investigated their lives, I found the two things that struck me were, one, many of them, the early ones, had either enslaved Black people themselves or came from enslaving families or families that had fought in the Confederacy. And so it seemed to me that this shed a certain kind of light on their arguments about how slavery had been good, and that Black people are a kind of public disorder and religion is part of that. And the other was how important their connections to churches seemed to be. It was in their bios, in their obituaries. They were Methodists, they were Baptists, they were Episcopalians, and that all. So they weren't, they weren't positioning themselves as kind of secular anything. And so to kind of think through what it meant for the authority of medicine combined with the authority of certain kind of Protestantism to set itself against Africana religion, like conjure healing, or holiness worship, or Pentecostalism, or new religious movements. Like, so what was that contest like? So it emerged out of thinking just that question of who were these guys, to the extent that I could find out more about them.
Yeah. Do we want to,
No,
Joseph, have you had a chance to look at the Q&A or?
I started to look at the Q&A. I wanted to ask just one question before we go into that, because I love this. I love this notion that the secular acts as a mask for the religious. It also, and I think this is it goes without saying, acts as a mask for like whiteness and and white supremacy, and all of those things simultaneously. And I think this is one of the questions in the arc in the Q&A that I wanted to kind of pull out for you, Judith, and for us to think about. What other things in the archive didn't you use? Someone asked. Someone was asking. The question is like, did you find any drawings or sketches and artwork? But I wonder, were there things in the archive that you're like, it didn't relate to this particular project or didn't help you with this particular argument that you might come back to? Right? Maybe I didn't know. Again, maybe did the artwork of the patients might be one of those things, or it might be something completely else, something that I'm not even thinking about. But what else in the archive, popped out for you? Were there other things that you were thinking about? And one of the things I'm always asking for, scholars like you two, is like kind of to continue to say, like, where are you going in the archives right now? Like, I would love to kind of have a sense of like what you're thinking about as you move past it. I know we're talking about this project and it's fascinating, but I want to kind of know where this project makes you think about next, or where it kind of points you in the future.
I'm never writing another book. I said that after the last one, and then I just had this one question. And now it's a book.
Yeah.
I didn't find artwork. I know there's actually there's some psychiatric literature from the 20s from St. Elizabeth's Hospital about arts and crafts and things. I didn't. I will say that the pandemic limited my research time, and I decided to conclude this book and to write the book that I could with the material I had. But there were a couple of things that I might have gone back for, and I don't know if those are saved. The preservation practices of St. Elizabeth's, or the government hospital, are weird, and then lots of other stuff got thrown away. But there were some things there were some, I don't know how to characterize them, kind of scrawlings of patients that were saved to make an argument of a kind that interested me. These files, as they're preserved, are very formulaic. And again, that's in some ways, that's why that man's hand on her head just really stood out to me. So I don't know if there's a lot in that kind of institutional archive that I would follow out. But I end the book with this guy, George Bennett. He has a huge archive at the Schomburg that I only, scratched the surface of. And he's just such an interesting figure who produces a kind of religious diagnosis of psychiatry. And I was surprised to find that, he had been institutionalized and diagnosed with dementia precox. I was surprised to find that nobody seemed to find him odd, from what I can tell, like in the neighborhood in Harlem. And so he's such an he wrote treatises about, he had a visionary experience and had a message to deliver. And I really only gave the barest overview of how interesting he was in the conclusion. So I might do George Bennett.
Oh, okay. I like that. I mean, that was an interesting, tale of that story of, kind of, this life after, like these afterlives. I mean, you frame the book as like, this afterlives of enslavement, and this continuing haunting of this project of enslavement, of containment, of white supremacy. But then there are these afterlives of people, so many of the folks in the text die in the institutions that they were hospitalized or contained in. But George Bennett, as you were just referencing, has an afterlife after the institution. And you kind of talk about that in some ways, which I think is really fascinating, and really important. Another one of the questions that I wanted to get at, and it's interesting to me as we close out, is this kind of notion of the institutionalization of leaders, of movements that might be seen as problematic, right? One of the persons in the audience is asking this question, and your book this study tends to focus on everyday containment, if you will. We might call it, but I think this question is asking: did you see examples of other types of more systematized containment, systematized control, where they were trying to control certain elements of the Black population, certain Black leaders, or certain kind of thought that was, developing or emerging in the broader public?
When I came back to the Father Divine material that generated the questions that created the book, I revisited several of those figures. Elijah Muhammad, when he was imprisoned for draft evasion, was subjected to a psychiatric evaluation and diagnosed with dementia praecox by the prison psychiatrist, and several other figures in the early Nation of Islam are institutionalized in the more Science Temple, and it became in that period a way. So the idea of the Negro cult was a focus of a lot of the sociological and psychiatric literature about adjustment, Black people's adjustment to the North and the Great Migration, and the ability to argue that the founders and leaders of these movements were insane became really useful in trying to position these groups as a social problem. So in other contexts, I really did want to think about the everyday, and I didn't find a kind of, I was looking for that, and many people had asked that question as I was first getting started of, was there a kind of programmatic move to contain certain kinds of religious groups? The last thing I'll say is when I turned to the periodical, The Apostolic Faith, for example, to think about early Pentecostalism, right, which would be, a lot of people had asked me about that, and it seemed like a good case that there's a lot of reference to being pathologized there, but it didn't seem like it was a move to contain the movement exactly.
Well, I mean, I know the hour goes by so quickly, and I want to thank Judith and Pippa for joining us and for being a part of this wide-ranging discussion. As I say to all the time, is like, get the book, read the book. Like, let's read the book together. Let's talk about this book more. I want to continue to think about the relationship between religion, American culture, and psychiatry, how psychiatry shows up in today's wellness, psychiatry and psychotherapy in today's wellness and health initiatives, what's happening on the ground in American religion and American studies departments. So this is a conversation that I think has long legs, and I am so excited, Jude, that you agreed to join us this afternoon. Pippa, thank you for coming along as a co-host and a panelist with me. And I want to just thank our audience from throughout this year and for today's episode for joining us. Please click on the link provided in chat to complete a very short survey and let us know if you have any other questions or comments or what other resources you would like to see about this book or other episodes. Stay tuned for Religion and Season 6 this fall, and please come check out this episode and other episodes on our YouTube channel, RACC2, or just check us out on our website. Thank you again, Dr. Judith Weisenfeld and Dr. Pippa for joining us for this conversation.